So, today we will be talking about one of the oldest, if not the oldest, dialogue of Plato, the Apology of Socrates. Now, to put ourselves very briefly into context, Socrates was a philosopher that lived in Athens in the years of the classical period, that is basically the second half of the 5th century. And he was a rather unconventional person. He was one of the representatives of the new enlightenment that had been brought to Greece during the classical period, which included the sophists and as a philosophical school, and a certain degree of skepticism related to old beliefs and conventions. Now, we're not going to dwell into any details about Socrates' life. He led a life, as we say, as a philosopher, where he attracted the attention of many followers. And after the end of the very long Peloponnesian War, which ruined Athens and saw the victory of its enemy Sparta, and the temporary government by the anti-democracy party of the aristocrats in his city. After this, and after the democracy was restored, Socrates, who was associated, whether rightly or wrongly, with the aristocratic party on the one half, and with the relativism associated with the sophists and the new intellectual currents that had appeared in the previous half century, Socrates, as we say, was put on trial. And this dialogue, which, as I said, is probably the oldest of Plato's dialogues. Plato was one of the followers of Socrates. This dialogue concerns the trial. So it shows us the trial. It shows us the speeches that Socrates allegedly made in front of the court that was going to judge him. Apology in this title does not refer to the modern meaning of the word. Apology in Greek refer to defense, self-defense. So this is Socrates' self-defense in front of the court. An important thing to note, we said that this is one of the oldest of Plato's dialogues, and it was probably written not long after the events themselves. So probably around, 499, not much later. Sorry, 399, at the beginning of the 4th century. And nevertheless, we shouldn't take these speeches at face value. This dialogue was written close enough to the historical events, and it was one of the early productions of Plato, so that we may believe that it indeed reflects the ideas of Socrates. But the classical Greeks had a different idea of history than we do. So, for example, one of the great classical historians, Thucydides, who was a contemporary of Plato and of Socrates, includes in his History of the Peloponnesian War many speeches, but they are not verbatim speeches. They're not the exact very words that people said in the assemblies. They are a recreation of what the historian, trying to be objective, thinks is the spirit of what the said historical figure would have said in that context. And here we may assume that there is a little bit also a distortion in that Plato represents, for the most part, what Socrates approximately said, and almost certainly Socrates' beliefs and ideas and his words to the court, but, slightly adapted, probably for greater rhetorical effect. In fact, this dialogue is, in spite of its self-defeating claims, of which we'll talk in a moment, is quite a considerably well and elaborate piece of rhetoric. Okay then, so having set the background, we say Socrates is on trial, accused of impiety. A popular court is going to judge him with more than 500 members. We don't hear the accusation, the initial accusation, which we know was formulated by 3 people, which are mentioned in the dialogue, Anytus, Meletus, and Giton. We start directly with Socrates' speech, his answer to the accusations. So, the first part of this dialogue, of the apology, will be Socrates' speech. And the first part of this speech acts as a sort of brief prologue. And Socrates starts speaking, and he says that, his adversaries have spoken. They were very eloquent. They were so seductive that he almost couldn't recognize himself in their description. Yeah, so they seem to be talking of a completely different man. And he very ingeniously says, okay, these guys are eloquent, they are rhetors, they know how to speak in front of the assembly and how to paint nice pictures, but I'm not going to talk you eloquently. They've said that I am very eloquent, but it's not true. I will speak you with truth, ἀλήθεια. I won't speak you with eloquence. So this is a tropos. This is a common idea that is recurrent in this dialogue. Truth as opposed to eloquence, saying the truth, following truth. In Greek, ἀλήθεια. You could say that most of Plato's dialogues can be synthesized into one word or two words. We talked about the Crito. The word there would be justice, δικαιοσύνη. The word here would be truth for this dialogue, ἀλήθεια. And Socrates says, I'm going to speak plainly, just as I did in the marketplaces, next to the money changers, in the agora. I will speak in my usual way. I am not an expert at speaking at courts of law. I'm not going to imitate the rhetoric for speaking at courts of law, a rhetoric that was very well developed in Socrates' time. In fact, a considerable part of the texts that we have preserved from the classical Greek age are basically speeches made for courts, which you paid a legal expert, or rather an expert in speaking about the law, to make for you. So Socrates is going to speak plainly. There is a little bit of more than a little bit of an irony in this, because Socrates' way of speaking is not really the plain way of speaking of the normal people. It's his plain way of speaking through the famous Socratic dialogue, interrogating people and getting their contradictions into the air. So Socrates starts explaining in his speech after this short introduction, after this prologue. He basically says that he has to deal with two types of accusations, and that he has to deal first with the more serious ones, which are the old prejudices about his figure, and then he'll deal with the recent accusation, the one that has just been presented at court against him. What about the old prejudices? Well, Socrates was an eccentric character, no doubt about that, and he was probably, to a certain point, perceived quite adequately as a relatively anti-establishment thinker, from the point of view not of opposing or fighting the laws or the norms of Athens, but in representing a new way of thinking, what we would later call philosophy, which was, an innovation in 5th century Greece, along with other things that were also innovations in 5th century Greece, like democracy, Greek democracy, Athenian democracy, or like tragedy. It was a time of intellectual, political, economical, social change, although by the end of the 5th century, Athens was experiencing the bitter part of this change through the dissolution of old values and old customs, and through her defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Now, Socrates had already appeared in, among other things, the comedies that were staged in the city. No less than 2 comedic plays had made fun of him as an eccentric local character of the city. One of them, The Clouds, by Aristophanes, is still extant. And it portrays a Socrates that matches very little with other texts about his figure, Plato's own dialogues or Xenophon's texts. Of course, it's a comedy, and comedies were always outrageously funny and parodic, and they distorted figures. But the Socrates that appears in The Clouds is a buffoon, a natural philosopher, a sophist who teaches lies, how to lie and speak eloquently to get away from trouble, and to satisfy your basest wishes. So Socrates starts saying, okay, first of all, I have to fight before the accusation that is not physically present here, but is already present in your minds, O judges. The old prejudices that are commonly held, that have been commonly held by everybody. Since your youth, O judges, you have heard of me. Yeah? And these are intangible but very strong prejudices. Socrates is quite pessimistic about the possibility of being able to dispel them, especially in so short a time as he has for his defense. So basically, these prejudices add up to 2 ideas, Socrates as physic and Socrates as sophist. So one of the prejudices is that Socrates is a natural philosopher. And natural philosophers, at this time, they had appeared more than a century earlier in the Ionian coast of Asia Minor. People like Thales of Miletus, Anaximander and Anaxagoras, Heraclitus of Ephesus, and others, they were believed to be averse to the traditional gods and the traditional explanations of things. They were believed to be explorers of nature and covert or implied atheists. In fact, more than one of them had already had to face trials for impiety at Athens. Yeah, one of them, a friend of Pericles, had to run away. I think Anaxagoras had to run away to avoid being judged for impiety. So this is a common prejudice about philosophers at the time of Socrates. Socrates is accused of being, or suspected of being, one of these guys. He's also accused of being a sophist. Now, the sophists' main characteristic, there were two. First of all, they were intellectual relativists. They mainly criticized the idea that the law, the nomos of any city, had an essential truth in it, and each city had a different law, and all of them were perfectly adequate. Man is the measure of all things is a famous quote that was made by the sophists, but its meaning in this context basically refers to the relativism, the fact that humans use their different intellectual beliefs and their knowledge and their intellectual limitations, and they extrapolate it to everything. They consider that those local beliefs are, universal and valid for all time. So the sophists believed in relativism. They didn't believe in universal norms, or at least they criticized the norms and the laws of the cities, the specific laws, as not binding and not universal. On the other hand, the sophists were teachers. They did believe in teaching and the virtue of teaching people and of being able to teach them to become better. In this way, they were part of the intellectual criticism of the old aristocratic values, the idea that you could become a noble person because you had noble blood. So sophists would say, no, that's not true. You only need a good education. And sophists peddled their rhetorical skills for money. So they were teachers. And this was a common prejudice against that also extended to Socrates. We would say in a slightly paradoxical way, because Socrates, as he very clearly expresses in this dialogue, never charged for speaking and probably never taught publicly, clear set beliefs that he had. He was more of a questioner than of a dogmatist. But anyway, whatever the truth, the common belief in Athens is that Socrates was like these guys. He was a natural philosopher and he was a sophist, a person who defended and taught rhetorical skills that upheld wrong arguments, a person who distrusted and no longer believed the old religion of the city and the old values and the old social order. So Socrates clearly rejects these accusations, these implicit accusations. He even adduces witnesses. He says that they are the standard criticism that is leveled against all philosophers, and they just heap it upon himself. Now, he says, okay, but a counter-argument might appear. Even if you believe that I am not a natural philosopher and a sophist, you will probably think, okay, if you are accused, you must have done something. And you must be strange and different from other people in some way. If you had just been a normal person like all the others, the possibility of you being accused wouldn't have arisen in the first place. And Socrates says that, okay, he's not exactly like the other people. And he mentions an episode, I don't know if historical, or we have to take Socrates' word for it. And we imagine he wouldn't be so daring as to lie directly to the court. But then again, this is Plato's speech based on Socrates' speech. But anyway, Socrates says that he mentions an episode. One of his friends went to the Delphian oracle, and with a question: is there any man wiser than Socrates? And the oracle of Delphos, that is the words of Apollo himself, answered back that indeed no man is wiser than Socrates. So Socrates, when he received this, he says, he was, at his wit's end to understand such an oracular proclamation. Then again, the oracle of Delphos was notorious for always speaking in riddles. So it never spoke clearly. You had to interpret. its pronunciations. So Socrates says, okay, I had to untangle the meaning of this riddle. And, I finally decided that the oracle was right in that I am wise because I am aware of my lack of wisdom. Yeah? Other people think they know things, think they are wise, but they're mistaken. I know that I'm not wise, that wisdom is something attainable perhaps only by the gods. Uh, but I am aware of my lack of wisdom. I'm aware of my limitations, and that is my wisdom. And because all others are too paid of themselves and proud and think they know, in that way, and in only that, am I superior to them. In the fact that I know how ignorant I am. And in this, the Delphian oracle shows its truth. And after this, Socrates explains us how he began a quest to test the Delphian oracle and to check that indeed he was the wisest person and that indeed those who he thought might be wiser than himself were not so. So he mainly says, so he tested politicians, poets, craftsmen, and he found out that they all lacked wisdom. Yeah? At best, they had a partial knowledge of specific things, of technical matters, techne, and yet, in spite of their ignorance, they believed that they were wise. And when they knew something about a specific area of knowledge, they instantaneously assumed that they knew about all areas of knowledge. So he did this. He interrogated these people with his Socratic method, which is asking questions and getting people to contradict themselves. And he says, the people get angry when they're made to look as fools in front of other people. And when the Socratic dialogue shows that they fall into contradictions and that they do not appear to be as wise as they thought they were, after being tested and led to logical refutations, the reaction of most people is to feel angry. And because they're angry and humiliated, and they can't say, Socrates showed that I was an idiot, those maligned people, in his opinion, basically slandered him. And that was how he got his bad reputation around the city. What is more, he says the gilded youth, the sons of the aristocratic families in Athens, who have little else to do except enjoy life, saw him with these Socratic dialogues. They found them amusing, and they started to follow and imitate Socrates. And this contributed even more to the anger or to the indignation that Socrates generates, and to those accusations of him being, a sophist and a natural philosopher. Because, as we say, the accusers can't just say, Socrates has shown that we are idiots, that we are ignorant people. So these were the old accusations, but now Socrates is not in court because of those commonly held beliefs. He is in court accused by a very recent accusation made by 3 people. And now, after he has dealt with the old accusation, he deals with the recent one. So he says the charge, let me paraphrase the charge that has been leveled against me by Anitos, Meletos, and Giton. The charge basically is that Socrates is a corrupter of the youth. Socrates does not believe in the old gods of the city, and instead he preaches that new ones should be followed. So he focuses his answering back on one of the accusers, on Meletus, one of the 3 who has spoken before. And he says, I don't know if this guy Meletus was really serious in making this accusation. I'm not sure if he's taking the court seriously because, he's a person that doesn't really care and doesn't really know about these things that he pretends to defend. That is, how to teach the youth properly and belief or lack of belief in the gods. And he makes a quick cross-examination with Meletus, which is a mini Socratic dialogue, which in the usual Socratic vein leads this Meletus to contradictions and to making a fool of himself. So the interrogation of Meletus begins with some questions. So Socrates asks, who can improve the youth? So you believe that I corrupt them. Who can improve the young? And Meletus, he's not too eager to answer. He's afraid of falling into the logical pitfalls for which Socrates is famous. But Socrates manages to wring him out the answer that everybody except Socrates makes the people better. And Socrates evidently shows the absurdity and the unlikelihood of this claim. He basically does it through examples of the natural world, of animal husbandry. Yeah? As in humans, so in animal husbandry, not everybody can train a horse well. There is one man, a trainer. The horse trainer is the one that can make horses better. And he says, it's absurd to say that the whole city and the whole youth of the city will be corrupted by only one man. Happy would be the city if everybody was making people better and only one little Socrates was making or trying to make the people worse than they are. Another question that Socrates makes: do people prefer living along with the good or along with the wicked? Obviously, he answers himself, people prefer living next to the good. So why would Socrates want to corrupt the youth and therefore create for himself vindictive and angry neighbors? He says this is absurd, and either Socrates is not corrupting people, or if he is corrupting them, he does it unknowingly or unwittingly, in which case he should be instructed, not taken to court. Another question that he presents to Meletus is, how does Socrates corrupt the youth? And the accusation seems to be that Socrates teaches new cults, rejects the old. But of course, the accusation, as you might have noticed, is a bit wide and a bit ambiguous. So Socrates asks Meletus for clarification, and Meletus insists that Socrates is an atheist. He rejects the divinity of the sun and the moon and of the other creatures. And Socrates says, this, if I were to be claiming this, which I am not, but if I were to be claiming this, I wouldn't be very original. So Socrates, Anaxagoras, who had been judged for impiety, had already preached these things, and the fact that they were his beliefs was common knowledge in Athens. Yeah? It was a well-known teaching of his, so Socrates wouldn't be able to get any merit for preaching what is somebody else's speech. And anyway, the charge against Socrates is contradictory, because if Socrates, as in the accusation, and as he rings out of Meletus, believes in divine and spiritual agencies that are different from the traditional gods, but gods, then Socrates is not an atheist. He believes in some sort of gods. And well, so through some sophistical, some logical reasoning, Socrates gets the logical conclusion out of Meletus that Socrates, if he believes in spirits and demigods, has to believe in the gods themselves, who were the creators, the fathers, according to Greek mythology, of the different spirits. Okay, so having dealt with Meletus, Socrates continues speaking. Next on, he moves, so he says, well, I've finished with Meletus, so let me continue speaking about other topics, but I've dealt with his accusation. So the judges might say, okay, Socrates, so you might not be guilty, but aren't you ashamed of having led this life of yours, presumably following this Delphian oracle to interrogate people, and having through this type of life of yours placed yourself in a position of peril, such that your life becomes threatened because of this? And here, Socrates expostulates on the need, on the obligation that a person has of doing one's duty, of doing what one thinks, what one feels, what one knows to be right. So he starts saying that even if his mode of life has placed him in danger of death, one shouldn't worry about that. One should only worry about doing the good, avoiding the bad, not about living or dying. So that's what the good man, and we could say the good life, is all about. One should worry about doing the good, avoiding the bad, not about death. And he makes very good examples about why being in peril and preserving one's life cannot be the ultimate ratio, the ultimate goal of people. He says, if we did this, if we really believe this, then why do we respect the heroes from the past, the Homeric heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey? These people lived lives that were brief. They risked their lives for honor. They searched death even knowing that they would most certainly die. Socrates himself had fought in the wars for Athens, and he had done his duty, and he stayed at his post in the army at Potidaea at Delium. in spite of, being exposed to death. But one must do one's duty. And he says there is an irony in this. If I were to keep quiet and not live this sort of philosophical life of inquiry and interrogation that I lead, I would then be proving the accusation of atheism that you level upon me, because then I would not be obeying Apollo's mandate. And Socrates says, I'm not afraid of death. I'm not afraid of death. And he says, it is stupid, it is unwise to fear that which we know nothing about. And rather than avoid a certain good for a possible evil, one should avoid a certain evil instead of a possible one. So he knows that it's evil not to do one's duty and not to follow his way of life. Nothing will stop him from searching the good and the wise in dialogues and obeying the God. Nothing will stop him. So Socrates explains that, he has a mission. Not only did the God intend for him to check and prove that he was the wisest by interrogating people, Socrates serves a useful function for the city, although it might be an unpleasant one, at least superficially for the citizens. Socrates is a gadfly. Yeah? He says he's a benefactor of the city. His questions, his humbling of the arrogance and pride of the citizens, his pushing them towards searching the real good, the real virtue. His pushing them is, he is a benefactor of the city. He's prodding the citizens to virtue. And besides, his acts are selfless and disinterested, which is a proof of their divine mandate. And this is confirmed by his poverty. Yeah? He is completely poor. This life of his of teaching, not of teaching, of indirect teaching, of interrogating, of testing, this life of his is not the life of a sophist. He hasn't received emoluments for all of this. He's still poor as a rat. But this proves precisely the fact that he is following the divine mandate, and that he is working for the profit of the city of Athens and its citizens, not for himself. Here he mentions his demon, answering the question of, okay, so if you are so good at this, why have you only made your interrogations in private, to individuals as private citizens? Why haven't you made these interrogations, these pushings for following virtue and good deeds at the political level? Why haven't you got involved in politics? So Socrates says that he has a kind of familiar spirit, his demon. And his demon basically stops him from acting sometimes when the effects would be negative. Not so much to him, but perhaps to the cause of following the Delphian oracle. So he says this demon didn't allow him to participate in politics, didn't allow him to speak in public. And he thinks that it's probably because he would have perished quickly from it and would have been unable to follow the oracle. So political life in Athens, especially in the last years of the 5th century, was a pretty tempestuous thing, with lots of exiles, executions, proscriptions. So Socrates, he is making a mild not so mild, a pretty direct criticism at Athens, saying, if I had dabbled into politics, you would have killed me long ago and not now. And he wouldn't have been able to follow the oracle. Yeah? Politics was, as I said, very dangerous in Athens, and he explains that even though he hardly dabbled into it, he was forced 2 times to get minimally involved in politics, and both times almost cost him his life. And he explains that at the trial of the Aginusae, he was the only one that upheld the norms of the law in judging the accused generals from that battle, and that almost got him killed. And later, during the tyranny, the oligarchical government of the 30 tyrants, they tried to force him to collaborate in the illegal execution of a person, and he refused, even though that probably would have meant his death if the government of the 30 tyrants hadn't fallen shortly after. So, why do people enjoy so much conversation with Socrates? Why does he enjoy it so much? Why do young people follow him to see these cross-examinations? Before, it had already been mentioned, they don't have that much to do, the rich guys, the rich youth. But he says this is a show, this is a pleasure to see a cross-examination in the Socratic way. It is a humbling of pride and an amusing spectacle. And he says, these people who listened to my cross-examinations, who enjoyed them, who practiced them themselves, these young people who are supposed to have been corrupted by me, they're all willing to speak in my favor. And some of them are here in the court, and he names them. And he says, okay, maybe they are deluded, but their families, their relatives, are also willing and enthusiastic in defending myself. What a paradoxical corrupter, he who is beloved and who is defended by the people he was meant to have corrupted. So finally, Socrates is about to conclude his speech, and he has expressed the bulk of what he wants to say. And the last part is just a technicality. So he basically says that in the usual practice of Athenian courts, when a person was accused, we mentioned that there was, a legal vocabulary and protocol, a rhetoric that was quite effective and used by advisors, expert legal advisors who drafted speeches in exchange for money, of course, for the people who stood accused of different crimes. So there was a theatricalization in this legal speech making and speech making in front of the courts. One of the conventions of this practice was generally inspiring pity on the judges, like wearing poor clothes, crying, begging, showing one's relatives and the members of one's family. And Socrates says he won't retort to this. Yeah? He says he isn't going to beg, he isn't going to cry, he isn't going to attempt emotive supplications at court. He doesn't believe in that. He thinks that trying to bend the law is immoral. So a person should be judged and condemned based on justice. And if he's guilty, he should be found guilty. If he's innocent, he should be found innocent. The law shouldn't be bent by mercy. The law should be just. And he says even more so in the case of a person like me that has a public reputation. If the state were to pardon people just because they begged and they inspired pity, if the judges were to behave like that, they would be being unjust. And if a person were to beg for his life and cry and so on, and try to get in this way the laws to be bent, he would be demeaning himself and the city. Okay, so the judges hear the speech. They have already heard the accusation. They've heard the defense. So they retire and vote. The vote, this is not described, but we jump directly to the results of the vote. And Socrates has been found guilty by a relatively small margin. Yeah? And he expresses surprise at this. Not because he was expecting to be acquitted. On the contrary, he expected a much worse margin. And, he says, I don't have a lot of time. If I had had more time to convince you, perhaps I would have been successful. He says in some cities, those who are sentenced to death, some days have to pass before the sentence is decided upon. So in those cases, I might have convinced you, but I haven't had enough time to bend, to destroy those prejudices that were held about me. Now, in the Athenian legal system, when a person was found guilty, then the sentencing depended on two offers, on an offer and a counter offer. So the accuser presented a possible punishment, and the guilty person was expected to present a counter offer. And the judges had to choose between one of those two offers. They couldn't, make anything in between or offer their own proposal. They had to accept between the two offers for punishment presented by the accuser and the accused. So Meletus asks for the death penalty. He wants Socrates' head. Socrates now has to propose an alternative, and he continues with his rather haughty line. So in spite of having been found guilty, Socrates knows and feels that he is not guilty and will not really recognize his guilt in front of the court. In fact, he asks rhetorically. He said before he was a benefactor for the city, and he still believes that. And he says, what is deserved by one who worked ceaselessly for your good, pushing you to seek wisdom and virtue? So what do I deserve? Says, well, I think that what I deserve is a reward. I should be publicly feasted and fed in the Prytaneum. So the Prytaneum was the place where the Prytanes, high magistrates of Athens, met. And it was also a place where public benefactors were fed at public expense, most notably the winners at the Olympic Games. So if an Athenian won the Olympic Games, he earned also the privilege of being given meals and kept in the Prytaneum of Athens. So, in a very provocative statement, Socrates' penalty proposal is, you're going to keep me, or you should feed me and keep me in the place of honor in this city. Is this a deliberate provocation or not? Well, some critics believe it's a deliberate provocation. Others think that, well, maybe not. Socrates pretends in the dialogue, after having said this, that he is not, trying to enervate or to provoke the judges. It's just that he can't ask for something bad for himself because he's completely convinced that he's done nothing wrong, and he cannot bring a certain bad on himself just because he might be afraid of the counter proposal of the death penalty. After all, remember, death is not necessarily an evil thing. Why should one demand for oneself an evil instead of something that might not necessarily be an evil? So, still pushed by his friends, Socrates says, okay, let us consider other possibilities, because I know you evidently won't send me to the Prytaneum. Should I stay in prison and serve for some time? I don't think so. I'm an old man. It's not this time of my life for me to spend locked away in a dungeon, a slave of the state for an indeterminate amount of time. Maybe exile? No, I will not accept. I'm too old to become a wanderer, and anyway, I am not willing to give up my inquisitive lifestyle. So if my compatriots can't bear with me, foreigners won't bear with me either. So exile is not really a rational option. A fine. Well, Socrates says, I'm poor. I don't have a lot of money. But okay, my friends are pushing me to accept a fine. I can propose at most 1 minae of silver, because I'm a very poor person, but they propose 30 minae, and my friends will help to pay this expense if this penalty proposal is accepted. Okay, so finally, the last part. The judges again vote on the sentence. This time the result is much worse than previously. The other option, that is the death penalty, is decided upon, is voted upon, and by a larger majority than the previous one that had condemned him. So the trial is over. All that is left is for everybody to retire, the execution to be prepared. Later we will know that because of a religious festival, execution wasn't carried immediately after the trial and the sentencing, which would have been the case otherwise. But in the brief time that Socrates thinks he still has left while everything is arranged before his execution, he still finds time to make 2 short speeches to the judges. And he's going to make a different speech. First one to those who condemned him to be executed, and then to those who voted in favor of him just having to pay a fine. So to those who condemned him, he first says, I'm an old man. He was more than 60-something at this time. Soon to die. Having him executed will only accelerate his death by a little and will bring a bad reputation to the city. The city will be remembered as a killer of wise people, of the killer of the sage. And he was quite right in this. Athens, the memory of democratic Athens is forever stained with the murder of the first and the greatest of the philosophers of classical Greece. Well, the greatest that's open to deliberation, but at least a founding Christ-like figure. And he says that, he didn't lose the trial because he was incapable. So he tells the judges, if I had wanted, I would have been able to persuade you. It's not lack of eloquence or ability to defend myself effectively that has led me to this death sentence that you have piled upon me. But I'm not afraid of death, and I'm unwilling to demean myself. And that's that. But he says, all is as it should be. I'm not angry, He said, I was expecting this, and death is not necessarily an evil, so I'm not angry at you. But he makes a prophecy. It was believed that people who were about to die could make prophecies, and Socrates makes his own prophecy. He says, "Others, more pressing and unrestrained, will come after me to censure your evil deeds and wrong thoughts, Athenians." Yeah? Killing Socrates won't stop that. You think that by getting rid of me, you get rid of philosophical criticism, of being pushed to become better persons. But no, you have just dealt with me. More angrier and more passionate accusers will come in my footsteps. Finally, to those who voted for him, he says, "You are the real judges. Judges I call you because you really are judges, because you have judged fairly." He says, "Don't worry. I'm not worried. The demon that I have, that we mentioned earlier, that demon, which always stopped me from speaking in the past, whenever I was going to say something inadequate, has kept silence all through the trial. He hasn't stopped me. He has always stopped me from doing evil, and he didn't stop me through the trial, through everything I said up to now. So that means clearly that death cannot be an evil." And he says that for death, he speculates more about the afterlife in other dialogues, as we will see when we talk about the Phaedo. But here he does introduce, as he will very briefly in the Crito, the belief or the possibility of a belief in an afterlife. And he says death is either one of two things. Either it's a final extinction from which you never wake up, in which case it is like an eternal rest with no pain, and it's much better clearly than being alive, so it's not an evil. Or in death there is an afterlife, and you get to travel and to meet and to talk with the great men and sages of antiquity, and you get to be judged by real judges who are better than these world's judges. And in either case, whether one or the other, it will be a good thing. And Socrates is glad with it. He says, "No true evil may happen to a good man." So death is not a true evil. Anything that men can do cannot affect the good man, because the good man does what is good and follows what is wise. The only evil that could be done is turn a wise man into a fool, and that is not in the power of men to do. And finally, he finishes with an admonition to the citizens to punish his own sons if they ever move away from virtue and true recognition of their own worth. So he insists to the end on the path that he followed. If my sons ever devote themselves to profit and to wickedness, and they are too proud of themselves, you have my authorization from beyond the grave to punish them. And this is the Apologia of Socrates. Very interesting dialogue, very foundational. I've been speaking for too long, so I don't want to prolong this any further. I'll just say that I was surprised while reading it with the striking parallelisms between, the Jesus of the Gospels, the Judeo-Christian view of its founding father, and the founding father of philosophy as represented here. So this and other dialogues constitute what we could call the Gospel of Socrates according to Plato. And we get a very similar figure to the biblical Jesus. That is, we get an unconventional man who probably, or quite certainly, was against the establishment in some ways, not in a violent or aggressive way, but who represented new intellectual, philosophical, religious trends that opposed current beliefs being held by their respective societies. Both of these people were unfairly tried and executed by their respective establishments, but both founded a school of followers that became legion after them, and that continued the cult for the founding figures and for the traditions and the beliefs that these founding figures started off.